everyone, and thank you for coming back in. Open for the last coffee drinkers, because we have a lot on our plate. So I think we really had a wonderful sort of selection of views and perspective in sort of our first part so far. Well, of course, we did not give our speakers an opportunity to engage directly with one another, and not with you, of course, which we'll do some as well. So basically what I want to do now is open it up, but try to look at questions or theme that as I was listening to the various talks sort of came up in different ways in the conversation. And of course, that reflects my own mental models and frames, and I'm happy to diverge from that, but try to sort of bring it together and have people sort of have a bit more of a back and forth on what they think. And I think one place to start, because there's a lot of different kinds of questions that we can ask. Part of the motivation for all of the behavioral revolution, if you want to say, or behavioral intervention generally, and specifically in the context of climate change and household energy conservation that we focus in here, was really the notion that there's something wrong with people, either because they're misinformed, or because they make mistakes, or maybe because they have some other issues that those who wish to kind of overcome that you do this. And I thought it was kind of telling, because I used the term, I think, shaping behavior. Then Kim said, Professor Torr said shaping behavior. I would like to think more about goals we already have, or in your presentation, right, things like existing motives and so forth. So I think one very rudimentary and basic level, before we start digging into, when we do this, how we do this, how we assess this, is like to kind of on the front end. Do you see, and that's also afterwards to be our panelists, like any kinds of places where you feel more comfortable or less comfortable to say, this is the kind of thing that we really need to fix, and we know with confidence that this is a mistake. This is the kind of thing I would not interfere in, because it would be more like shaping behavior. And one way, to use a bit of economic parlance for it, one easy fault line, not perfect, but easy one between beliefs and preferences, right? If you think about some of the stuff that Professor Taubinsky mentioned, right, the basic idea was, and even the way it was measured in the sense, it would be, we have an error that we can measure, and which is really both mostly about judgments or beliefs, so like what people think, or underestimation, overestimation, other kinds of things. And there are other places where it's a bit more tricky. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think about this. Are you comfortable of using the kind of tools you talk about, equally comfortable using it for all the goals that you mentioned, or there's some things that you think are a bit more pushing the envelope, and some that are like obvious low-hanging fruit? So let's start with you, and then you want to start?
Sure. So maybe just stepping back a little, I think of how you can use behavioral science sort of on the spectrum, and like the true nudge work has this idea of libertarian paternalism. There are things that we generally think are good for people, that people generally want. They want to be healthier, maybe they want a good environment. And some of the nudge work is gently nudging them towards doing things, and we can question whether they actually valued that health improvement or that environmental improvement. But I think there's also a role for behavioral science just broadly in improving the design of things. And so where I feel most confident in using behavioral science is when we are simplifying processes for people, making information easier for them to absorb. So how many of you have had an experience where you're dealing with some sort of government process or website, or you've done your taxes lately, and you're like, why is this so hard? That's unnecessary, right? And when it starts to become, you have to go through all these steps to even apply for a program that you're eligible for, a lot of people will just give up. So there are ways that can use behavioral science to make the most important information salient up front, and we can simplify, and as we like to say in psychology, chunk the information so that people can find kind of the landmarks and figure out how they're supposed to move through it. So a lot of my interest really is, as you said in the introduction of me, like, how do you improve the design of things to work better with how people process information? That is a space that I feel pretty confident in using these tools and regulators.
Anybody else wants to?
I'll make it more extreme and then maybe I'll pass it down. So, just to make it fun. And I agree with a lot of that. I think that people don't realize that, and we find this in this utility that I chair the board of. Our staff doesn't realize that if you make people click 2 times to get to something, you get a substantial drop off in their participation. Like that's behavioral knowledge. It's sort of the frictional cost or transaction cost. That's the kind of cost we'll talk about. So I think that kind of knowledge is really useful. I would just say 2 quick things that just to, again, make everybody want to talk more. So I think a lot of what needs to happen here is what I think of as market democracy. So I believe that our current democracy is not reflecting public preferences at a level that's unusual in American history. And I think what's different, so I would ask, for example, who's the largest regulator of assault weapons in the United States? Yeah.
Walmart?
Unfortunately, it's Dick's Sporting Goods, but if you have the second copy of my book, if you're really interested. My point is simply, we have a conception of our democracy which assumes it's governments and voting. But we are moving more and more into a less democratic state. As we do that, I think companies are exposed to retail investors, retail borrowers, retail customers, and their own employees. I had the head of a large tech company tell me it's our employees that are dominating almost everything we're doing in the ESG place. So my only point being, I don't think we should shy away from a law school level engagement over what is democracy, to what extent can it occur through the private sector versus public sector. And then I guess the other thing I would just say is it's fascinating, this worry about whether we shouldn't be shaping behavior. As I drove up here, I was confronted twice at a gasoline station with the question, do I want cash or credit? And the word credit never appeared first, right? And I don't think I've ever seen it first. Why is that true? You make more money if the gas station gets your cash than the credit, where they have to pay a percentage. So we're faced with default settings all the time, including by companies. And if we're really going to be balanced here, we better engage more broadly. Lastly, I would say, I never worked on climate change until about 2004 or so, and I had a physicist give the climate lecture in my class. And when he was done, I just boxed up, and he's a very balanced scientist, by the way, not alarmist. I just boxed up my other work and I set it aside. I've only published a couple other papers since, because I think this is a problem that we're going to be wrestling with in here. So here's my thought. The question is not nudge type or behavioral interventions today that shape or simply reflect preferences versus nothing. It's that versus in 20 years, a much more draconian system. That's the choice we have to make. This problem is not going away, and there's going to come a point at which people demand action. And in my view, if you're a libertarian or conservative, the time to deal with this is with the least intrusive messages as early as you can, because what's coming over the horizon is a much more draconian system, not one that I think many conservatives want, and assuming away the climate problem isn't a way to get from here to there.
So I would like to kind of bracket a little bit the political question and really focus more on the other stuff.
Sure. So for me, one of the big distinctions that is important is a number of years ago, I associated it with, to some extent with Thaler and those guys, but I also associate with Jonathan Gruber. Gruber writes, he's sort of upset that people are still smoking. And so he sort of says, we need to do all these things to get people to stop smoking. And, the problem is there's an internality. People are not sort of worrying enough about their future selves. And that distinction for me as an economist, I'm more okay with government or policy sort of working on externalities. But once you sort of do this fakeness that says, I'm not the person who's best set to judge the future consequences of my decisions, that really worries me. And one of the things that I think feeds into this is when you look at the behavioral stuff for smoking, for example, Michael's colleague Kip Viscusi has tons of research suggesting that to the extent that people know about the risks of smoking, they way overestimate them. They don't underestimate them. And so to me, a lot of this all seems as pretextual of the libertarian behavioralists or those sorts of things. They really have an outcome that they want, and they're willing to kind of shade things, shade their vocabulary, shade even kind of what they're doing to just get to their outcomes. And that bothers me. And that's a lot more worrisome in the case where it's you doing what's right for yourself versus, hey, we can actually identify externalities. That's more properly a government role from my perspective.
So let me inject a couple of nuances into the discussion we've had so far. So one theme that I just kind of want to follow up on from what I was talking about is that people making mistakes is not always a bad thing. Let me give you another example. So the one is connected to what Jonathan was just talking about. Sometimes people might overestimate the cost of smoking, which actually makes them smoke less and reduce the externalities on society. You know, another example, for example, is we know that people vastly overestimate the likelihood of a tax audit, which makes them behave better when they file taxes. Something might be on our minds, but it's April 15th coming up. That's also a great mistake for people to make because it reduces the distortionary effects that come from tax evasion and tax avoidance. So not all mistakes are actually a bad thing. And you know, as we were talking about before, the devil is really in the details. You know, it's always context specific, you know, and we just need to think about each situation separately. Now, on this point, like, do people make mistakes? You know, are people dumb? Are people hyper rational and never make mistakes? And you know, I think again, kind of the view that I would suggest is a view of moderation. You know, every time I write a paper that's about, you know, payday lending, or, you know, energy efficient appliances, or, you know, why do people buy lotteries? You know, I basically end up, when I just do the data analysis, I do the cost benefit analysis, and where I land is at neither extreme. You know, I think the realistic view of the world is that at the end of the day, people are pretty much the best judge of what's actually best for them. And it's certainly no one's role to tell someone else what's best for them. It doesn't mean that people are supercomputers and never make mistakes. Sometimes it's helpful to give people some information that lets them better understand the consequences of their actions. And I think the right kind of criterion, you know, before getting into all this language of internalities, time and consistency and so forth, is just to say, what would a person do if we help them fully understand the consequences of their actions? That's, I think, a very sensible normative standard. And I think that's a normative standard that in some cases would say, you know what, some light touch regulation, you know, cool off periods when it comes to payday loans, you know, moderate subsidies or taxes and energy space that kind of help counteract some of those mistakes. You know, under that criterion, you will have moderate policies. You're rarely going to reach an extreme view, and that's really kind of my suggestion, is just to be, you know, kind of moderate and realistic, and really kind of the devil's in the details, and everything is context specific, and we just need the right tools to analyze the different contexts.
As a parent, I'm frequently in a position of having to tell my kids I do know what's best for them, and I genuinely believe that. Yeah, I guess I would just underscore what Dr. Wolske said, because I think it's in the instances when the policy decision's already been made, the macro policy decision's been made, that the democracy deficit is at its ebb, right, at its lowest, right? When we've already decided we're collecting taxes at a certain instance, and we just want to make the tax process easier for you to comply with. That strikes me as the least kind of philosophically problematic of these kind of instances.
So I'll say something else if you want, but so just what about externalities? So like Dmitry, like what if my choice to fly isn't just my choice, but it's imposing a burden, you know, 500 generations in the future, plus my current colleagues. How is there a role for government in that setting?
Yeah. So, of course. Yeah, that's always. I assume that we all agree that we should address externalities. My comment was just about how to think about the possibility of addressing what some might call internalities. My comment.
And we can go back to externalities later, because this is definitely relevant for the assessment of things, but kind of thinking, so, you know, we talked a little bit about that, and this question that I asked before, and that you guys gave your opinions on, kind of dovetails with something that cannot be separated. In fact, I think Professor Taubinsky's presentation showed how it's really not separate. The question of which interventions we are going to use, not in the sense of assessing that they're even at benefits, but when we try to look particularly in the behavioral space, which is our focus, these different kinds of behavioral interventions, are there some kinds of interventions that a priori, like sort of Professor Vandebergh before said, oh, just, you know, one click instead of two. It seems like we're simplifying, we're providing like simple, seems like a relatively easy thing, particularly if on the backdrop you have, what Professor Huber said before, is that a lot of that stuff, even if we recognize that we ought to do cost benefit analysis, the fact of the matter is, to the best of my understanding, looking into that stuff relatively recently, that outside of the largest environmental regulation in almost all areas of government stuff, not even talk about other kinds of players who play in the space, we rarely actually do cost benefit analysis. It's kind of honored in the brief. So in theory, we have a commitment legally to do cost benefit analysis as part of our regulatory assessment process. In fact, most of the time we don't do it because it's complicated, because it's costly, or maybe because people just want to get things through and they don't think they're going to be disciplined. There could be different explanations. So kind of before we even get to assessment, are there kind of interventions, particularly in behavioral interventions, that we are kind of particularly happy with? We heard some of that. Are there ones that we sort of more maybe worried about? And there are some, and I think Dmitry out of the slide, for example, the cigarette graphic warning labels, and we could think of other examples in other domains. I give whole courses on these things. I could have tired you with that, and we're not going to do that. But are there other things that we are a bit more worried about, either because maybe they operate as you might think, sort of as a tax or penalize people, even those who do not want to change the thing? Can they maybe like the, or maybe I'll bring up one single slide, because both Professor Taubinsky and Professor Wolske have mentioned the home energy reports, which I think are a good example for our purposes, because home energy reports, this is an early example of like the early edition of the home energy reports, just a top part of it. Those reports by now have been delivered over 1 billion times. The company O-Power that I believe you helped at some point, Professor Wolske, the company who came up with this idea in 2000 and around 2009, the sort of thing has been bought by a small company you may have heard of called Oracle. And it's now a subsidiary of Oracle. It's a very lucrative business. And they digitalize, which raises a whole other range of questions that we don't have time to get into today. So it can come to these like nice apps or in other ways get to you. But the bottom line is, when you look at this and you have it mentioned, you see a bunch of things. You saw the social comparison, how you do compare to your 20% most efficient neighbors, which of course is something that the people who designed thought would be a good way to get up. It doesn't say how do you compare to your average neighbors, or at least didn't used to. It doesn't focus, because a lot of people, in fact, by definition, half of the people are going to do better than average. Or if it's a median, at least, it would be half the people, relatively normal distribution. And the idea was to motivate more people, right, to save more. So let's compare to the most efficient homes, for example. Or if we look at that side of the screen, I don't know if you can see, it says how you're doing. And it had more than average, good with a smiley face, and great with 2 smiley faces. In this example, it's good. Again, this implies the existence of a social norm, or tries to create one, that says, you ought to conserve. We know that it's good for you to conserve. People think that it's good to conserve, but try to sell you that thing. By the way, in the very, very first iteration, where it says more than average, there was a frowny face, but people hated it so much that they eliminated it very quickly, and just kept the smiley faces. So you could wear a frowny face. But the bottom line is, obviously, it tries to give you information. It tries to motivate you by comparing to others, but it also tries to tap into other things. So, and this is just one example in this space. There are many, many other such things. So does everyone kind of feel equally kind of comfortable with 1 click instead of 2 click, as opposed to trying to, not through the democratic process, as we heard has problems, and we'll talk about later if we have time, but through kind of subtle regulation, try to change people's preferences, not through debate and so forth, or try at least to run these through social norms.
Can I just say, I think you just kind of put the rabbit in the hat a little bit. You said not through democratic processes. And I heard this, I had a back and forth with Justice Gorsuch about a year ago, where he said, well, EPA is adopting these kind of policies 4 levels down the bureaucracy. And I can tell you, having been at the top level of bureaucracy, that doesn't happen. Like a major policy within EPA gets adopted after it goes through a multi-tier process. So I don't think we can say that adopting a process like this is through a less democratic process. I think we just have to set that aside. We may like it or dislike it, but this is really not that different from any other regulation that's adopted. It simply goes to a different office, but it has to go up to a Senate confirmed official who's subordinate to the president, who's public elected.
But I would say this is actually not more like regulation, but it's really like what we face every day in marketing. When, you know, when somebody tries to convince us that something is cool or that we should buy it and so forth. And then we have a certain set of assumptions and ideas that we're not going to get into about how the market works and where we discipline it and where we're not. The slight differences here, and this is coming from ComEd because they have a mandate that requires them to do that. But you know, you could imagine, and we saw in the pandemic, like Nike coming early on with a really cool ad that tried to convince people to stay at home. You know, so they're not trying to sell shoes directly. Maybe they're trying to make it brand look, you know, cool and caring. And they're not, so where we have regulation about what they should or shouldn't say to us and so forth. But here it really is an attempt to not correct errors only, but really more than that. So that's sort of what I'm trying to tee up. You know, obviously a lot of people feel relatively comfortable about that. And as I said, more than 1 billion of them have been sent. Most of you, anybody here as a household in the United States probably got them. Please.
So one of the things on this kind of nudging or whatever you want to call it, marketing, depending on your view, is I would wonder how the baseline is set, right? So, so Dmitry said, you know, one of the things you'd like to do is if the person was sort of well informed or fully informed, what decision would they make? And that sounds great in principle, but since you know we had been earlier talking about the smoking example, it turns out public health and actually some European countries have tried to implement that. And what they say is the choice people would make is what doctors would do. And doctors smoke at 2% rates. And so that should be our baseline that we're shooting for. Well, of course, that's nuts, right? Doctors also drive BMWs. Should we all drive BMWs, right? There's all sorts of differences. The average smoker has lots less income, lots less education. Why not use what nurses do? There's more people smoking, nurses smoking on break outside of Sloan Kettering than almost any place else, right? And so those choices are, first of all, not obvious what someone would do if they were fully informed. And you know, people are making choices that aren't necessarily going through democratic processes. And that's my worry about these sorts of things.
What I would ask is as compared to what, like, so if we don't do this, and in a decade, people get super concerned about climate change, we're going to get a much more stringent regulatory process. And so I always look at that. And I think when we've been signaling a lot about sort of asymmetric skepticism or credulity in some areas, and I guess I would have kind of come back with this question, you know, where are the private benefits? Why have we not spent much of the day? A psychologist would tell you that when you engage in some activities, you feel below, as an economist would say, or you feel an attachment to your identity, you feel better, greater levels of well-being. So it's one thing to identify the private costs of nudges, but we also have to identify the private benefits as well. And if we're going to be balanced, we need to do both, and it's on net what really matters. So I would just say that's really important. If you're looking for an example of a nudge that to me seems like kind of a no-brainer, that's an opportunity that's missed. This happens all the time. So here's the card I had on my pillow from the Morris Inn, which was wonderful, by the way. That's a very very nice one. So, and this happens all the time. It gives you two efforts. You hang your towel up, and you don't ask them to change your bed linens. And it says these two efforts will reduce the amount of water, energy use, and detergent use daily. And what's fascinating is I think the research would show this will have almost no effect, right? But if what you said is 85% of the people who used this room over the last year did these two things, right? Then it will have a very substantial effect. And I don't know, maybe there's some private cost there, but it could be balanced out by feeling pretty good about what you do. But what's happening there is people are responding to a descriptive norm. And to me, that's a social site-driven phenomenon, widely demonstrated. And I asked a friend who was the chief sustainability officer of a major hotel chain, like, why is your chain doing this? Like, you guys know this has been out there for 20 years. And he said, our marketers won't let us because they're trying to make everything a crisp brand setting. So my point is only, in a lot of cases, many of the things that we know would be most effective are either not known or there's some other pushback that occurs. In government, the way that pushes back, and I'll be quiet, is an example would be Sunstein at a conference at Columbia a few years ago was talking about how he was trying to change the cafe labels. But it turns out that the statutes are incredibly specific about what you need to include. So there have to be like 8 different things in a cafe label. So the labels that you were showing are possible in the abstract, and we can design the best ones. But actually in government, you couldn't do that. Even someone like Sunstein, who knows the literature, couldn't change the label because there was a statutory restriction. The other place you see this all the time is when governments are trying to make things easy on people. If an agency messes up, it gets oversight from Congress, and its officials get embarrassed, et cetera. So what do? They adopt lots of bells and whistles and requirements for a qualifying, and what does that do? That reduces the participation on some level. So these are all complicated institutional arrangements as well.
Right, and there's a couple of things I mentioned, but I want to go back to the earlier one, was actually something that Professor Wolske mentioned in an earlier question about the kind of benefits in your warm glow example. And that would be something to include, but as we hear, those of us who have been following the conversation right from recent decades until recently, people have not been asking what's on the other side. So I think warm glow should be measured just like the inconvenience or the feeling of being pushed. And by the way, the example of the towels is actually a very nice example, because almost every hotel now has some version of that for a simple reason, right? Their incentives is for you to use fewer towels because they save costs. They don't discount the room price. So they would have an incentive to do that. I mean, if your friend that lets the marketing people, if they think that the characteristics of the brand is worth, say, $1 million a year, that's their, prerogative. They're a business. They should run their business whichever way they want. I assume that another hotel who just wants to economize will find a way to do it better. And maybe also, by the way, if they gave the information, that's a tricky part about information, is that maybe it's not 85%, maybe it's 23%, right? And if you give people the true information, that's still preliminary, because what's, I think, very common to many of these engagements in the climate area, which is not obviously my expertise, is that you're really trying to shift, and that goes back to this conversation, right? You're trying not only to provide good information, but you're trying to shift social norms. You're trying to make something because you believe that you know what's good for society, and that society is not doing it at the moment, and we need to get people to see, not only because they underestimate a future risk, which may be part of the story, but also because of all these other factors, which is, I think, part of where that conversation is. But so I'd like to ask, which other benefits, Professor Wolske, I think you mentioned before, like other benefits you think we're not looking enough at, and of course, on the other side, which costs maybe we're not looking enough at.
Well, to comment specifically on the home energy reports, there's a way of framing this that this isn't about shifting a norm to help the climate. And in fact, Power will never write anything about the environment or climate in anything it does on these reports. Is to think instead of how is this helping people save money and save energy. I was trying to make the point earlier that people don't think about their energy, and they don't necessarily think about the opportunities where they could use less. So potentially getting this report and realizing, the homes that are near me and like me are somehow getting by using less, means maybe I've missed an opportunity to save some money. Maybe I leave the heat on all day in an empty house and I could actually adjust it when I'm gone. And that's actually an action that adds up over time. So I do think this isn't just about some goal that someone else is setting and deciding is a good thing, that this can help people achieve their own goals as well.
So just to comment on that, so I think so I like that way of thinking about these Power kind of type nudges, and because just before I was going to kind of make the point that we have to be careful. What I'd love to see more is a more clear articulation of what are the market failures that we need to address, and why is the lever that we're choosing, the one that's best poised to address it. And I like Kim's discussion of this. It's, it may be one statement really reminding people that they can be more energy efficient. I think it does also illustrate that there's a very fine line, which probably doesn't even exist, between informing people and altering what people feel. So maybe saying that you're less efficient than your neighbors is information, but maybe it just makes you feel terrible about yourself. And I think that's what Avishalom was getting us to talk about. And I think that is a very important effect to quantify. And it's actually one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the word nudge, because usually nudge is supposed to mean something like it's light touch, it doesn't affect opportunity sets. But man, if something makes you feel terrible and anxious, and experience a lot of social pressure, I think that is affecting your opportunity set, and you can't, that's not light touch. I mean, that might start bordering on emotional coercion. And I think we have to be careful in separating between what is more like information, and what is more like emotional coercion. The other thing is just to come to the debate with Jonathan here. I think also we should be mindful of what assumptions we're making. So I like that Jonathan agreed with me that in principle, the criterion of, what would people do if they were fully informed is a good one. Now, if you agree with that in principle, I think it's making a very strong assumption to say, well, in practice, it's hard to figure it out. So let's ignore the possibility completely that people don't always do what is in their best interest. That is just as strong of an assumption as any other assumption about bias. And so we just need to be very clear about, what assumptions we're making in any kind of an analysis.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I don't think I'm getting an answer to a question I have in sort of the default setting. It seems to be for critics of nudges. Again, I don't like the nudge term either, and I think we need to be really careful how we use it. But is that there won't be some other more coercive or more expensive action? And it seems to me that's a deeply libertarian view and probably not consistent with where likely society is headed. So I guess I really want to provoke this conversation. If we don't use nudging techniques, I've been a regulator before. My team was called the Gestapo by I know how coercive regulation is, right? And that's, I think, what's next. Or maybe it's very strong carbon pricing on the climate front. So why is this? Why wouldn't you give a fair amount of decisional space to this stuff as a way to head off that? Are you just assuming something worse is not going to come over the horizon? Or
why do you think something, can you say more about why you think something worse is on the horizon?
Because you have to pretend that climate change isn't serious in order to not see that.
Okay, but I mean, like the last 10 years, political.
No, it's been pushed off, no question. I don't know when it will happen. I have no idea. What is it? Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. That's a joke, by the way. I raise my hand in class when I tell really stupid jokes. So, I mean, maybe you disagree with me, but I don't imagine a world in which 20, 30 years from now, we're not very concerned and very willing to use very intrusive measures to avoid what is coming.
I don't think there's any sense in which a financial tax is more coercive than an emotional tax. I think emotional manipulation in many ways is at least as coercive as financial incentives. And, and that is why, what I was trying to advocate for is let's just do the cost benefit analysis. What are the direct effects on people? What are the indirect effects that come through behavior change? And that's that. We don't have to have a philosophical position on what is a more coercive or less coercive lever. We just need to do cost benefit analysis, and emotional effects are just something that enters as a cost. It doesn't have to be part of, a more difficult to define philosophical notion of more or less coercive.
Okay, I think one thing to throw into the mix that is sort of implicit in what Dmitry was saying, but maybe as I'm going to about to the crowd, what happens with tax, particularly say consumption tax, is that it operates on the people who consume in proportion to their consumption. What happens with this type of thing is that anybody who at least opens the envelope or maybe doesn't open because they know what they're going to see, and we saw that the behavior change is small. It may be significant in terms of like doing real estate. But yeah, cumulatively it could be huge, but it means that, we are saving 2%. I don't know which, actually, and I did not put up that slide. Alpert and Kessler has an interesting study from 2019 of the home energy reports in natural gas usage. And there are a few amazing things that come out of that study. They actually managed to come, and you're not on that paper, so I can say, they managed to come with an average treatment effect of like 0.77 cents per season for the savings. And with certain assumptions, some of them, if you look at the appendix, you don't have time to get into, but basically assume a lot. But even if that is correct, what's interesting there is the distribution of how people value it. And the reason it ends up in the green, according to them, is because about 40% of people value it a little bit more than the cost of the nudge, and some value it a lot. And then almost 60% valued less than the nudge or negatively, but not enough to make up. So they managed to remain limited. And that goes back to the point before. So when we have a tax, the operation is A, more transparent, and B, is distributed differently in the population. Well, sometimes these things, so I completely agree that someone may just need to be reminded, or it really aligns well with their beliefs and helps them do better. There are people like that in the population. I mean, to ignore that, I mean, that would be silly. Just like the fact that there are a lot of people that actually enjoy their consumption and they do not want to reduce their lifestyle, be cold in the winter or hot in the summer, or put on a sweater, or have their laundry, remember to set the laundry for the right time of the day the next day and have it wrinkled and so forth. There, people value those things, and if it's like, a very large proportion of the population that values them even a very little bit, once we actually start ask questions of cost and benefits, we may land in different places, even if we are not saying this cannot help anyone. Not even if we're not saying this is horrible for every purpose, so that I think is the point, and that kind of brings us, I guess, to the question of assessment. And I think, Michael, you tried to tease up this idea that we need to recognize that we're not going to have cost benefit analysis a lot of the time, and feasibility is important. And how do people kind of feel that, or that feasibility
be built into the way we evaluate future areas.
in the front end, though, you want it, like before we even know, because you said, nudge today or intervene today versus something.
I'm okay with doing it with a CBA in the abstract first, no problem. My concern is when CBA is used to take down a non-intrusive policy on the assumption that there is a better one working there, whose feasibility has not been assessed. I mean, I think what you see with where the IPCC is going, and I've published half a dozen papers on this, is people are finally beginning to realize that, and Jonathan Gilgan, I had this piece that we circulated, there is an opportunity cost here, and we talk about the need to account for opportunity costs. You can't engage in the political process right now without seeing the last 30 years of where was the carbon tax. It was beautiful all along, but so long as people are going around and picking off and critiquing using CBA, each one of these alternatives to a carbon tax, the underlying implicit assumption is, oh, there's a better system. If that better system isn't out there, then the CBA beautifully applied that creates negative responses among a bunch of politicians who just see the bottom line they hear is a one sentence or two, gee whiz, nudges aren't good. That's what a policymaker will walk with. So then what do you do? What's in the policy?
Guys, after that, I think that explained a lot of the appeal to behavioral approaches, is that the regulatory authority already exists. It's a bit ironic, I guess, for an event hosted at the law school, that one thing we haven't talked a lot about today is legal authority.
Right.
And many of these interventions can be implemented by an agency without a rulemaking process tomorrow.
Right.
And that explains their appeal.
Right.
And that's all.
Appeal to whom?
Well, I mean, no, appeal to them, but they're the ones in the office. So in terms of explaining their behavior.
Appeal to somebody's kind of
But so one, you had originally, I thought, teed it up more as a philosophical question, or why are the libertarians sort of upset about this stuff? And I think one big starting point is to separate out something that is arguably externality, like climate change, versus a bunch of this other stuff, trans fats or things like that, which it's hard to make an externality claim. I know people will say, well, you pay for these people on Medicaid, you pay for these people on Medicare, but of course the libertarians would say, well, the problem is that's a fiscal externality. We solve that problem by getting rid of Medicaid and Medicare. So I think that is at least part of the answer. Another part of the answer is you frame it as climate skeptic. So there's a sense in which, and some of this probably comes through because of the behavioral stuff, make these claims with much more certainty than exists, right? We hear a lot of the claims and we don't talk about, well, okay, estimates are from here to here, right? And so maybe part of it is people just don't think that the experts or the regulators are actually being honest with them.
like just one thing. I think one thing that we need to say in terms of cost benefit analysis is that, and I think what we heard here is a good example. It's actually they're putting a very low bar, just not be in the red. They know, Professor Taubinsky didn't come and say there may be a different intervention. They say you end up in the red, which means, by the way, and that's true about externalities, about any other problem in society. There are problems that we may have nothing is going to have 100%, but we may have relatively broad consensus truly in society, not just among the experts, but among the voters, that it's something that is a real problem. And but that does not mean that any solution that we have available at this moment will not put us more in the red. It means that we need to keep on working on solutions. Maybe we need to spend those billions and trillions, if they're even necessary, on pushing technological innovation to the exclusion, all that stuff, so people will not have to sacrifice a lot, whatever it is. And I don't even have a strong position on this, but just to understand. So that there is the use of cost benefit analysis to say, you know, these three interventions are all in the green, and this one gives us great net benefits. And if that's the world you are living in, and then you find out that we're basically saying the best one that is not feasible, you know, is making us not consider all those other things that put us in the green and really improve where we are as a society, that's, I think, then the feasibility becomes at least an argument that I think most economists would at least entertain. But if you end up, and people can argue about, you know, the nuts and bolts, are you doing it right? Are you counting all the benefits? Are you cutting all the costs? But when you get to the bottom line, if your bottom line is in the red, if you believe the bottom line in the red, it doesn't matter if the world is ending tomorrow. It means that we're going to be worse and we'll end a minute earlier. And if not, then because you have a sense, whether it's because of the discount rate, or because of your belief that technology will not change, or because of where you believe the range of estimate really is, or various other factors, then you don't think we really are ending in the red. And I think what cost benefit analysis and tools like that do, and that's their advantage, that they force some discipline on the conversation. They're not perfect, and people can argue till the end of time, are you doing it right or wrong? But at least they have to say more than, I think there's wrong. They have to kind of, you know, sort of put their, and that I think is part of the,
Right, and we agree on that, and I think Kim and I both are advocates, we published together and separately of different ways in which to make the psych literature, I think, more rigorous and more policy relevant. And she just had a big piece, was that in Nature Climate Change, it just came out?
Nature Energy.
Nature Energy, okay, but, so yeah, I think there's a ton of support, I guess, there's a couple things that I worry about, I'll just put it on the table. One is, I don't see in some of the things that you all do, revealing in the text that there is a wide range of uncertainty of the estimates that occurs, and that sometimes those cross over. So sometimes conclusions that whether something is good or bad are actually overlapping, and I think a full disclosure of that is important. The other thing I would say, I started a whole journal in the environmental law field because when I was at EPA, I was reading academic literature, but I didn't have time as the chief of staff, and I didn't have time to read 400 footnotes. So sorry if you're writing those articles right now, editing them. But what I was looking for was a short version. We produce short versions of the best literature each year. And what I would say is that the econ community would be, I think, well served to be really cautious about not engaging with feasibility expressly and not thinking carefully about how someone who reads the abstract of your paper and who doesn't have a lot of options is going to walk away with conclusions. On the future thing, I have a really interesting thought on this. So my understanding is that most economic models about the effects of climate change assume economic growth, right? So the question is, what reductions in growth occur? And I think we all just need to be aware that there are possibilities in different scenarios where that, it's just like what happened before the 2009 economic meltdown, where the analyses of home mortgages all assumed a growing home price. There is a point at which that might not occur. If it does that change the analysis? So I worked with a psychologist to do this study. We asked if you had $100, how much of that $100 would you attribute to your reputation while you're alive versus after you die? And I was just trying to look at a different way to get at the same feature as a discount rate. What do you all think? How many of you would put $0 toward your reputation after you die, because you're dead, right? So what do you care? So how many of you would put that there? All right, yeah, so this is an econ class, right? Okay, how many of you would put $20? 30, 40, 50, nobody wants to answer. 60, 70, somewhere in that range. Okay, so the answer we got in a big, robust study was roughly $40 is what people would put toward their reputation after they die. I teach at Vanderbilt University. It's not the University of the middle part of Tennessee, right? Vanderbilt cared a lot and gave enough money to found a major university, with the idea being that he would be remembered in the future. We remember who founded the country. We remember all these things. So future reputation matters. And what we found that was interesting is that people care the most about their reputation among their descendants. So they care a lot more about what their great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. So we suggested as a behavioral response, the formation of a legacy registry. And we could keep it here at Notre Dame, because Notre Dame will be here for 500 years. So you could fill out a form. Oh, no. The Catholic Church has been around for almost ever, so maybe it's almost literally permanent. So we asked a bunch of, you could fill out a form that would say, here are the things that I did when I knew that climate change was serious, as a way to let your great-great-grandchildren know what you did and how you valued them today. And we think there's a pretty good chance that would affect your behavior today if you did that. We asked computer scientists what computer format would work in order for people to be able to access that. Because I can't access the floppy disk from my old Apple IIe. And their answer was print it out. Print it out. So we keep them in the.
Okay, thank you. So let's use this opportunity, we'll just go through the panel, and if anybody has a couple of like final words that they want to throw into this question or beyond, to get their say, before we open it for a few questions from the audience. Please.
Sure. Kind of going to this idea of how we're measuring costs and benefits. So this is typically done with willingness to pay estimates. And from psychology, I have some concerns about how that's done, because we know from quite a bit of research that when you prime people to think economically, it actually changes how they behave. So they become less pro-social and more worried about self-sufficiency. So if you're using measures of willingness to pay, it's quite likely that that measure is maybe conservative, or it's distorting how much they actually value this intervention. And it may mean that other reasons that they would get a warm glow from responding to a home energy report are not actually being captured in that estimate. So I think, like, as this field grows, it's something we need to be worried about, that these other less tangible things are not, it's hard for people to access them. So I'll just put that there.
So this isn't necessarily behavioral related, although I think it maybe becomes particularly salient there. I think one of the worries that a lot of libertarians have is this mixture of the positive and the normative, right? So I'm not a climate skeptic at all in having the physicist or whomever tell me, here's our best models, here's, statistically fluent, you can tell me kind of the uncertainty and things like that. I'm not skeptical of that. I'm skeptical of the therefore we should X, Y, Z, and that's what I worry about. And we saw a lot of that during the COVID stuff, right? We had public health people making claims that were outside of public health. They weren't just the parameters into the social welfare function or decision. It was, this is what you ought to do, and that's where I get particularly worried and skeptical.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say, again, on this theme of dotting I's and crossing T's and why it's important, sometimes rightfully, people get very worried when they see, I made these 5 assumptions, and under these 5 assumptions, this is what I concluded, because you're like, I don't think assumption 3 or 4 or 5 are completely plausible. The point I want to stress, though, is that any conclusion we make rests on very strong assumptions. And the biggest difference I actually see in styles of work is, are you explicit about the assumptions you are making, or are you not? So in the Bernard et al. Paper that I think we're all comfortable hammering in this group is, it's a paper that doesn't write down a single assumption, the way that some of us would do if we're doing formal cost benefit analysis, but actually makes some terrible assumptions, because in its normative claim, it makes the erroneous assumption that if we wrote down something a little bit more coherent, that all that matters are average treatment effect. So the parting thing I want to say is, if you disagree with certain assumptions, that's good. Writing them down and being explicit is actually how we make scientific progress. If you worry about making assumptions and you're just not going to be explicit about them, that actually is a deterrent to good scientific progress, because it's through debate and very clear articulation that we're going to reach consensus and better policies.
All right, I'll close merely by agreeing with myself.
Are you making assumptions here?
The legal authority question, I think, mattered. Just coming back to Mike's point earlier on about Congress having not acted in 30 years. If Congress was functional right now, we would have bigger fish to fry because we would be here debating basic policy approaches of more strident variety than the kinds that we're talking about now. And I think that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Here, and please say your name because for the audience.
Okay, Leo Slater, I'm a 2L, don't have any PhDs or any other non-MDs for that matter, but
You had the courage to answer a question before, right?
that's true, that's true. I didn't use the cheat sheet though, it's sad. But yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm just wondering, so Professor Klick touched on this with, I think, the positive normative distinction, but it seems like one of the really big dividing lines between the nudge and anti-nudge people and maybe like the more libertarians versus the Sunstein libertarian nudge people is that it's my impression that like a huge cornerstone of most libertarian theory and law and econ probably is that human preferences are a black box. Like we don't look inside the black box. I mean, there's like internal external thing, and we'll give you as much information as we can, but you value the price. Like the price is what the person puts it as. And it seems like the nudge theory, like against the title of Sunstein's paper, like it's not libertarian. You're undermining that principle as soon as you start saying, we're going to start telling you what your value preferences should be. I mean, is that not right? That seems like a massive disconnect there between nudge theory and like most libertarian theories.
So I think you put your finger on something important, right? So it's kind of a little bit deep into the weeds, but if you take guys like Hayek, you take guys like Coase, you take guys like Buchanan. Buchanan specifically said this. He's not even sure that there is a utility function until there's actually a transaction. And so it's the transaction that defines things. There's not some pre-existing utility function. And so, yeah, that gets to this, there is this libertarian thread that sort of says preferences are totally subjective and unknowable. And so some of the stuff is a little goofy to kind of use technical things.
I think in terms of, to get to Dmitry's point, in terms of revealing your assumptions, I think that kind of list of assumptions should be in the front of a lot of economic papers. I agree with him completely that we only be really transparent and not intermingle.
You have Kate, and then
one of the things that I was curious about, what each of you have talked about, nudges and incentives in different capacities and kind of your perspectives on it. I'm wondering from a behavioral or psychological component, so much now when you think of social media or apps or things of that nature, there is that almost like addictive quality to it that people's brains will get trained the more they're on their phones to get positive responses. And then they'll be more incentivized to do it. Are you seeing any types of like apps or programs that are trying to target perhaps younger generations to be more energy conscious?
This is not a direct answer, but I have to share the story. It's kind of related. So you can get the home energy reports digitally now. And someone just told me earlier this week that when she would go to the bar with her friends, they decided who would pay for the Uber home, who had the worst home energy report. So I think they built that in, right? Like that's become more addictive. I mean, O-Power has experimented with putting things on like Facebook. I don't know that that's published. I don't know if Dmitry knows. So I'm not sure kind of where that is in terms of social media using this.
And I think that tells you a little something that I'm hoping we'll organize. And I think this has been a really productive conversation, that we'll organize something through the National Academies in the future, which is a dialogue among various different social and behavioral scientists and the major NGOs. I think the fact that none of the major NGOs has a behavioral program is pretty remarkable, particularly given what you showed with the government programs, right? Why doesn't EDF? They have behavioral scientists, but they don't have a whole program. And particularly as we use this working from home transition is made, right? There's an enormous opportunity to create new habits and so forth, and to put pressure on companies to help their employees be more efficient, if we think that's a good idea. And so they missed that opportunity. And so the last quick thing I would say on that is, if you all look at the data carefully, when the like symbols were kicked in, what was that in Facebook and Twitter around 2011 or something like that, levels of well-being and happiness in your generation went down dramatically, right? And polarization went up. And we just need to think really carefully about whether these algorithms are tapping into some very fundamental intuitions we have, which are ultimately not functional in a democracy. I don't know what we do about it. I proposed a private fairness doctrine to substitute for the old fairness doctrine before, which our libertarian colleagues will bridle at. And there is a group called No Labels, which is trying to do some of that. Is it No Labels? NewsGuard, actually. I would look at NewsGuard if you're interested in trying to sort out a little bit that information that's coming to you. So I think a challenge is that we have moved from a system in which the news conveyors had to reach a very broad audience to those that are succeeding by reaching a small, narrow audience, and that plays into all kinds of democratic dysfunctions.
Yeah, my question is in regards to how do ideas about energy conservation or environmental awareness really comport with profitability? Because when I look at the issue, you have public corporations that have shareholders that they're beholden to, and a lot of the times, being environmentally conscious isn't always in the best interest of the people they're beholden to. So it seems as though that their hands are tied, as well as the people that are trying to, buy products from these corporations, most often and generally choose the cheapest option. So in the grand scale, is the only option that we have to fix this regulating them with the government, because everyone's hands are just kind of tied? That's my question.
Well, luckily, there's a brilliant new book out. No, so let's take a quick look, and I'll shut up because I know others have got a lot to say. But when I engage with corporate, and I think the ESG movement has made a mistake in trying to analogize itself to the CSR movement, corporate social responsibility. I think if you talk to corporate managers, what you'll find is that profitability in many cases does align with efficiency, right? It aligns with recruiting and retaining the best employees. Again, I had the head of a major a company that you would know say, we die tomorrow if we don't have a good reputation on climate because we can't get the best engineers out of Stanford and MIT, et cetera. Retail customers, again, hard to predict, but if you're doing business around the world, it's not the US customer at South Bend that you're worried about. It's the Danish customer. And it's not that they're going to pay more for an expensive green product. It's that they're not going to walk into your store in the first place. It's the reputational effect. We also know that institutional investors are often common owners or universal owners. So they essentially own the economy. And there's really interesting modeling that suggests, and again, some of my colleagues may disagree with this. I haven't done it, I can't argue it, but that if you were to force Exxon and Chevron to decarbonize faster than you otherwise would through ESG pressure, you would lose in your portfolio for those two stocks in the range of $7 billion, but you would avoid harm equal to about $9 billion, right? So who knows? Again, I can send you the paper on that. If you email me, it's not mine, it's others. But I would just suggest that that's also an important driver in all of this. And then managers have norms too. When you all go into the workplace, you're not going to walk in there and flush your norms down the table. And most of us care about future generations. And the law very explicitly gives us decision space. So if you're in a corporate law class and you're being told you must maximize shareholder value, go read the Revlon case and understand precisely in what situation you must do that, which is when there are a couple of bids on the table and you have to take the highest bid. In other situations, think about what that business judgment allows you to make decisions about. And from my perspective, when you're doing that, you're not licensed to do away with shareholder interests, but there are going to be a surprisingly wide range of situations in which shareholder interest and the public interest align in the modern world, particularly because of the social media pressure.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Okay. I blame somebody who's you, but I don't want to divert too much from our conversation. So let's go back there and.
I'm Lachlan. I'm an economist at Vanderbilt, actually. I guess a couple comments. So I think from like an economic standpoint, Dmitry kind of pointed out that the whole point, is to identify the market failures. And from my perspective as an economist, yes, the goal of the government is to kind of correct these market failures. So the identification of the externalities is kind of crucial to the welfare analysis. Because you're trying to induce behavior change to offset an externality that isn't being internalized by the market, right? And so, if you have a gasoline tax that's equal to the actual social cost of gasoline consumption, then that's optimal, right? But if it's not equal to that, then you're trying to change behavior so that you can adjust for those external costs that aren't being accounted for, right? And so, the first step is to understand and to measure these externalities, which is really hard and really impossible, right? Because, I think Jonathan said that, what are the externalities of the sugary drinks, right? Some people argue that it's like the health insurance premiums or, worker productivity, and so forth. Same with tobacco. Right? And so there are some measurable externalities in the literature regarding the different behaviors that these social interventions, right, might be able to correct for in the absence of actual governmental policy that's passed, right? And then the second thing is that, as everyone said, the devils are in the details, right? And, it's really important as policymakers and lawyers to understand the limitations of different studies. Right? So, the Kessler, Alcott and Kessler 2019, right? They did this report on home energy cost effectiveness of home energy reports. But when you look at the standard error, which is the measurement of uncertainty of those estimates, there's no real difference between people's willingness to pay and the savings that they receive from the home energy reports, which implies, yes, so the standard errors overlap between the home energy reports and the willingness to pay. And so it's a question of, is that a real unmeasured cost or is it just measurement error, right? And so I think the big takeaway is that there's some uncertainty here, and the tools that Dmitry has developed in the recent paper is important for measuring, help measure these costs in conjunction with Kim and other, psychologists to try to understand what costs go in so we can measure these costs accurately to better understand and have precise welfare estimates, because otherwise it's just, the conclusions of the welfare analyses are that the bounds are big, right? The confidence intervals are huge, positive and negative. So that doesn't really give you too much information from a policy perspective, but we need to have information on how to measure these costs and have a formal toolbox to evaluate them.
Thank you for the comment. Bill, we have time for one last question.
My question regards paternalism. We all talked about paternalism and nudge. And as Professor Klick said, we think we know more, we know better than the people to be regulated. And to a degree, we assume we do. But do we actually do? Do we really know more? Do we really know better? And a lot of times, when the when paternalism doesn't work, and it's not really about whether the people don't respond to the incentive. It's about whether the incentive is set at the right level. And in one sense, if you want people to switch to a new behavior, it's about the willingness, the demand for a price. Is the government, is the regulator, what is the government, is the regulator willing to pay for the switch, for the change of the behavior? And on the other hand, if you want the regular consumer to adopt a new technology, it's about how much they are willing to pay. It's a lot of times, because we make a lot of unrealistic assumptions, the cost benefit is the calculation is not correct. Because it's not correct, we are not setting the correct incentive. So that's why I think some of the paternalistic measures don't work. So that's just one comment I have.
Thank you very much. Actually, that reminded me of that very nice picture that we had there about New York and the difference of whatever it was 13 years or something. It's okay. It's okay. No, so I actually was to me the message that was very interesting, because the transition from horse and buggy to the combustion engine was not driven by billions of dollars of investment and heavy regulation on the part of the government trying to convince everyone this is what to do, but because people really wanted that wonderful product. So I think we can change behavior, and markets constantly do that. But part of my kind of optimistic thing is really about sort of innovation and development. And I think that's the biggest frontier in most areas, because in terms of both its kind of GDP contribution, but in terms of solving big social problems, I think that, and then everybody will run where you'd like them to.
I hope that they don't convince people that the horses were the conservative vehicles and the cars were the liberal vehicles, and therefore we shouldn't buy them.
I'm optimistic.
Good.
Okay, well, thank you very much for attending.